we will move on to our next speaker today is Peter Wakelin. Just a quick introduction. Peter is an independent writer and consultant who works on projects as diverse as conservation plans for industrial sites, exhibitions of modern and contemporary art and thematic research, and most recently a study of commemoration in Wales of people involved with slavery. He was formerly Secretary of the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales and Director of Collections and Research at the National Museum of Wales. His most recent book is Refuge and Renewal, which looks at the relationship of British art to refugee artists from Monet to the present. And I understand that he's going to give us a talk today about the UK context of art and industry. So hello, Peter. So if you'd like to share your screen with us when you're ready, and I'll hand over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Matthew. You can hear me okay, I take it?
Absolutely.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Matthew and Miriam MacDonald, for inviting me to take part in this all the way from rural Wales. It's a long way, and I'm very pleased to be able to come so easily to a Scottish conference without even having to put my shoes on. I'll share my screen then and take you through some thoughts about art and industry. There's so many ways that one could approach this, and asked to give some kind of overview of art and industry. I thought, I could spend all day doing that, and I decided to focus in on the question about how we as historians or curators or interpreters of industrial heritage and people trying to understand the industrial past, how we use images as source material. And so I called this talk Motives and Meanings, Reading the Art of Industry. People have been recording industry as artists for at least 5 centuries, I think. If we look back to Agricola's publication about mining in Germany in the 16th century, he was employing artists to record the technology that he was seeing and the activity that he saw of people at work. And I think it's probably true to say that the imagery from his publication is an almost unique source for us today. It's a fantastic record which enables us to understand a lot of what was happening in industrial technology at the time in a way that we simply wouldn't be able to do without the illustrations that are part of that publication. But as historians and other interpreters of heritage, we use sources in a critical way. And I thought it was worth trying to explore some of the ideas behind the evaluation of visual art as sources. And historians, in examining the sources that they're using, think in terms of motives as one of the most important aspects. And that means thinking about who made the document in question. What was it made for? What was its purpose? Because its purpose was certainly not to inform us. It was for something else. Who else might see it? Was it keeping some information clear because it had to be understood, and hiding other information which wasn't for its audience to know about? And what was left unsaid, what was important to the maker of the document and what was completely unimportant and not worth mentioning. So you can, I think, apply some of those ideas of source evaluation to visual art. And the first question is, who made this document? And I'm going to talk very briefly about 2 artists who made documents of industrial sites. And one of them is something of a hero of mine, Paul Sandby, who had begun working with the ordnance and as an artist, traveling around recording so that his masters in London would be able to understand the nation. And he travelled Scotland, he travelled Wales and England, and further afield too. And because his purpose was accurately recording, he, I think, could be said to have subdued his instincts as an artist in many respects to preserve as much information of a practical nature as possible. My view of this is this particular picture has got the water wheel unfortunately trimmed off by our miniature portraits. Different screen formats may be better. Hope so. So here, Lord Hopetoun's mines, he's recording with great care and integrity. And Paul Sandby, I think it became so much second nature to him to observe accurately that even when he was sketching a couple of boats on the Thames, every single detail that you see here is likely to be accurate and carefully recorded. It was absolutely an instinct for him. Another artist, though, is coming at the subject from a completely different point of view. Here's Turner's famous Rain, Steam and Speed of a Great Western locomotive heading over the viaduct at Maidenhead with the Thames below. And his interests are not in accurately recording the detail of the topography and the technology, but of giving an impression of this train, this creature of the New World, coming across the viaduct with the old world of the river, with a little boat and a bridge below, and a great sort of celebration and enjoyment of atmosphere and light, which was Turner's great contribution to the development of art in many ways. So people coming from a completely different place as artists in terms of their interrelationship with industry. What was it for is also important in looking at any work and trying to decide what it can be wrong to tell us and what it can't. This particular, there's my assistant just coming to shop. This picture is by an artist called Moses Griffith, who's not hugely well known, especially outside Wales, but is known as being the artist who was employed by Thomas Pennant during his tours of Scotland and Wales and elsewhere as well, to make accurate topographical depictions of the places that he went. And Griffith was an untrained artist who trained himself on the job and worked from this perspective of accurate depiction being the primary aim of his work. So if you look at this non-industrial site, but a drawing of a Chinese house at Shugborough Park, and you look at that today, you can see that he's accurately depicted the architectural details of that building and its situation. The bridge has changed since his day, and some of the roof detailing has changed since his day. But it's possible to test Griffith on a regular basis against reality and see how careful he was being to record exactly what he saw. Another artist, though, James, sorry, I can't read this because it's underneath the edge there. Hawkwill, isn't it? James Hawkwill. He was working in Jamaica, recording sugar factory, sugar works and sugar plantation here, amongst many other sites, in what he called a picturesque depiction of the island of Jamaica. So he was creating a publication which was intended to sell and which was intended to portray a picturesque view of this island with its slave colonies and its industrial premises. And so he wasn't going to be recording every detail of the industry and the technology, and he wasn't going to be recording the full and complex lives of the enslaved people of Jamaica. He was creating a sense of order and attractiveness that would help to sell his book, even to the point that you see not only these happy groups of enslaved people walking back from the fields, but others with time to go out on their own and sit under the trees and enjoy their leisure. One suspects a picture pretty different from the reality. I think it's important to think about the minds of artists in some ways, to think about the way that artists are likely to be thinking about what they do. Some of them are going to be very focused on their employment, on doing what somebody who's commissioned them asks them to do. Some of them are going to be very focused on sales, on the sales of pictures or sales of books in the case of Hawkwill. And some of them are going to be absolutely obsessed with what it is that they do. Some of them are going to be so caught up in the subject that they're depicting that actually any question of employment or sales is unimportant for them. And the truth is, of course, that most artists are combinations of all of these things. But it's important for us as interpreters of their work to remember that the necessity of employment, the necessity of selling, is part of an artist's life. And it was John Berger who said that, you know, when we get excited about artists, it's very often those times when somebody of a great artist, we define a great artist in a way as somebody who breaks out of the exigencies of their chosen career to do something which goes beyond the purpose of the art and becomes something that continues to convey meaning and importance for us ourselves. Constable is one of those. You know, Constable was somebody who was requiring to sell pictures in order to make his living, but he was also absolutely obsessed with recording the subjects that he loved and the subjects from his memory. So he was working in the early 19th century as his river on the Stour was becoming more and more industrialized, and he was painting his memories of boat building and boat activity a little bit earlier, with a absolute commitment to recording them accurately and thoughtfully. If we're thinking about motives and what art means, I think we have to think about why artists have made images of industry. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of each of these, describing, doing it because they want to describe industry, doing it because they have a promotional role in industry, doing it because they personally want to respond to it, or doing it because they want to imagine something or design something beyond the reality. So in terms of recording and accurately presenting, somebody like Richard Coltor, who was an antiquarian and a man very curious about the world, was, as an artist, trying very hard to record exactly what he saw. And sometimes he wouldn't necessarily have understood everything that he saw, as I think one feels in this picture of Blind Nab Ironworks. There are some features, particularly in the middle of the picture, that are quite hard to line up and understand functionally. Nevertheless, it's an attempt at a very accurate depiction of a new ironworks in the mid-1790s. We have an artist working for Le Tour du Monde, creating images, who's trying to capture and record an impression of the lower Swansea Valley in the 1860s with its forest of chimneys and dense smoke filling the air. Something that clearly horrified him, but was something that he wanted to record as accurately as possible. to tell the world about it through his publications. A contemporary artist, Falcon Hildred, recording an industrial suburb near the Woolwich Arsenal in London, working in such a way as to make the most accurate record that he can, with a combination here of plan of bird's eye view and also close-up details in other images. But even Falcon Hildred has to ask himself the question of what it is he's trying to achieve by doing this. And he said in depicting the cottage factory development in Coventry, was silk ribbon weavers' houses in these tall blocks with weaving rooms on the top floor and domestic accommodation underneath. He said, how do I depict it? He went and did measured drawings before the buildings were demolished in the 1960s, but he also asked himself, well, what's important to record? Do you record the factory, or do you record the depression of it once it had been built? Because something that happened almost after this building had been built and occupied was that there was a sudden collapse in the silk ribbon weaving market. And so many people were out of work. He said, I decided to record both. I did the measured drawings, it's all there. But in 5 drawings, I've gone solely for atmosphere. So he's bringing his interpretation to an objective record. Here's an example of somebody working for a school book, working as an illustrator, showing a locomotive boiler factory and an American factory at work. He's more interested in creating an enlivened image than an accurate image in terms of the measurements that might have been part of Falcon Hildred's view, but he is recording accurately something that he has seen. And it's important to mention photographers as well. As a photographer, you can take an atmospheric view, or you can be determined to record. If your purpose is to record as a photographer, then like Eric Demare, you can combine a very exciting image with one that's an accurate perspective view. And here's an artist that I've worked with a lot. He's in his 90s now. This is a painting of his childhood in the Rhondda in the 30s and 40s, where he is seeking to record in recollection, 40 years on from his childhood, what the landscape of the head of the Rhondda Valley looked like then, when it was completely black. Nowadays it's grown over with trees, and Charles Burton says it looks more like the Alsace than the Rhondda, but the food isn't as good. So artists are describing memories, they're describing technology, they're describing architectural details, but some artists are also commissioned specifically to promote sites. So here's William Porter's drawing of a set of factories in Connecticut. Porter made a career of doing this kind of print commissioned by the factories themselves to present themselves in the best possible way. And I think one can guess that the less attractive details might have been left out of a picture like this. That it may even have recorded buildings that were intended rather than yet completed. When working with a client to present their industrial premises in the best possible way, you are going to end up with something that's slightly different from the observed reality. And here, the artist Henry Williams, young artist who was growing up in Merthyr Tydfil, recording the rolling mills of the Cabot for ironworks. His relationship with the Crawshay family who sponsored him, I think, is expressed by the fact that if you look through the opening on the right-hand side of the picture in a focal point of our view, you can see Cabot Castle, the mansion of the ironmasters, looking down over their empire. And this practice of recording industry for the purposes of promotion of it, I think comes up to the present day, so and recent times. So here's one of the steelworks in Llanelli. To respond, artists frequently are making an image in order to show their response to it. So T.H. Thomas in South Wales in the 1870s wanted to show the social view of himself and his contemporaries about the dreadful nature of the employment of girls working on tips to recover material. Women and girls working in terrible circumstances in all seasons and all weathers. A response might be one that's very much caught up with the notion of the sublime, or the excitement of the exoticism of an industrial premises for an artist. So you have here Eric Malthouse going into a steelworks in 1953 and recording the charging of the open hearth furnaces with this sort of colour and energy that is the dominant perception for him. Or the artist Paul Cabot, a photographer who's fascinated by the geometrical shapes and the incongruities of power lines going across the landscape, and wanting to capture his response to these as unloved, but to his mind, beautiful objects. And to imagine or design, obviously people did design drawings often, and impressions of what a project would look like if completed. So you have Telford's rather eccentric design for the Clifton Suspension Bridge here. And the artist Anne Howson working on a big project at King's Cross, where she imagines the building of the Midland Railway as a kind of ghost under the landscape of contemporary or even future London rising above it. The artist Bert Isaac looking at the quarries of North Wales, Dorothea flooded slate quarry, and seeing it as a kind of allegory of nature returning to an abandoned industrial landscape. So when one comes across a picture like this of works in New South Wales, knowing nothing about the artist, how can one go about assessing the accuracy or purpose or meaning of a particular image in order to decide how to use it? I took this as an example of a drawing that I didn't know at all, to sort of test out that idea. One needs to go and find out about why the artist was doing it, who the artist was, what his or her background might have been. But one of the things that one can do fairly readily is compare with other sources. And so looking at that against a photographic record from a little bit later, you can see differences. The most important of which is probably the difference in roof design there, the parapet roof in the illustration and the eaves roof in the photograph, and the roof detail with perhaps a clock built into an elevated section of the roof in the photograph. One has to look at that in more detail to find out whether that's an artist making a decision, or there's been a fire and the roof's been completely rebuilt at some point. But these kinds of critical faculties need to be being applied all the time to looking at what artists do. And I think in many cases, this is my last slide, it's possible to come to a conclusion that an artist is doing something very something that can really inform us today. partly about their impressions and their feelings and the sense of being in a landscape, which I think is very much true of what we've just seen of Sue Jane's. But also in terms of understanding what exactly was going on in a construction project. And this by Moses Griffith. I remember looking at this painting some time ago and studying the history of Pontcysyllte Aqueduct in North Wales, and thinking that probably this was a rather primitive painting by somebody who didn't really understand what he's looking at, because those timber bridges are crossing in an impassable way between built-up columns. And it was only after looking further at that and then looking at the site that several of us at the Royal Commission realised that he was being completely accurate in depicting a temporary construction railway which had been built to cross the valley on the stubs of the piers, and the piers had been built up above that deck consecutively, working backwards. So where you see the crane on the left, that's ready to bring in the next level of construction railway that will go across on the piers at their higher level. And sure enough, when we looked at the piers, I don't know if you can see it on the right hand side, this drawing of the piers shows successive, very carefully blocked up putlog holes in the piers, in the masonry of the piers, which supported precisely the structure that Moses Griffith had recorded. So with that, I'm going to end and back to any questions you might have.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I, of course, have a question, but I'll save that for last, and I'll open up to Emma. Oh, muted.
Sorry, there we go. Thank you.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We have one question from Mike Sanders. Really enjoying the talk, Peter. Were the tip girls in T.H. Thomas's painting the same as Pitbrow lassies in northwest England?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I'd need to check what T.H. Thomas was recording exactly, but they can be people who are working for an industrial company in gathering material, or they can alternatively be, and certainly in South Wales there were people breaking up iron ore by hand out on the tips and preparing it and bringing it in, or they can be scavenging, essentially, people who need the small coal left over on the tips for their own homes. Yeah. I suspect it was that.
I think my extremely limited knowledge of lead mining would agree with that they can be doing all those things, yeah. Matthew, did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I'd like to ask about artists attempting to depict accurately, but not having the background knowledge of the industry or the architecture that they're depicting. Do you think that if an artist has a good, inverted commas, eye, they don't need to necessarily understand what it is they're depicting? Or can you tell when there's been a misreading or a misinterpretation? I'm just wondering if you have any examples.
Yes, I mean, if we compare the Cultor of Blind Avenue Ironworks with some of Paul Sandby's work, you can see that Cultor was actually an antiquarian and aristocrat. Paul Sandby was a very much a full-time professional artist with a fantastic eye. So Cultor was doing his best in depicting something that he was looking at. Sandby was also doing his best, but with a much higher skill set. So I think probably both of them would not quite have understood everything that they were looking at, but Sandby would have been better placed to accurately capture what he was looking at, even though he didn't understand it, than Cultor was, who was, perhaps filling in the details with an errant line here and there in order to complete his picture. That's that if you're doing source evaluation, I'm sure that that is another thing that one ought to be looking at very carefully. To what extent is this artist really familiar with the material that they're working at? And of course, one of the things about Sue Jane's work that we were just looking at is that by devoting so much time to studying these sites, she's coming at it in a completely different way from somebody who might have had a single assignment, because she's really understanding what she's looking at.
Perfect. I think there's another couple of questions, aren't there, Emma?
Yes. A question from Patrick. Do you know Peter Post, who worked in Brazil during Dutch colonial period, similar in some aspects to James Hakewill that you showed us?
No, I don't. But that would be an interesting person to follow up by the sound of it. Can you tell me the name again?
Yes. Question. Peter Post, who worked in Brazil during the Dutch colonial period.
Thanks.
And another comment from Sue Jane. Fascinating talk. Contemporary artists I've not heard of will now look them up. Artists inspire each other.
Yes.
And a comment from Colin Sanderson, a wonderful collection of images and forensic approach to their study. In retrospect, what is your opinion of Francis Klingender's art in the Industrial Revolution? And with what institutions have you had relations, perhaps coordinating on these matters? The Science Museum in London, Museum at Iron Gorge, Telford, others?
Klingender is a wonderful example of somebody capturing a subject that had really been ignored before. The project that I did recently that Matthew mentioned about artist refugees, slightly considered refugee art historians as well. And Klingender was one of those people who arrived in Britain as a refugee from Nazi Germany, and made this fantastic contribution to his new country. And I'm full of admiration of his ability, like Nicholas Pausner, to grasp a new culture and research it and produce a kind of foundational study of a subject. So still enormously relevant and useful. I haven't been coordinating on this with other people. I'm very much just doing my own work in a quiet way rather than doing a major study of this subject. But fascinated always to hear about what other people are doing. You've persuaded me to talk about it in a way that I haven't talked about it before. So it's not that I'm doing a full study of this subject. It's just a long-term interest.
Oh, good. A question from Mike Sanders. Thinking about the question of how much the artist knows about the industry, how does art produced by workers within the industry compare with that produced by professional artists?
I think I can think of a few examples of workers within the industry who, yes, they do come with an understanding of the subject that makes their work particularly useful. There are the Pitman painters, for example, who have painted life underground in ways that very few other artists have ever had the opportunity to access. And I can think of people in the tinplate industry who there was a man called Tony Evans who worked as a young man in the tinplate industry before becoming an art student and having a career in art. And yeah, he did a whole series of works which really accurately depicted the industry. But you've always got this balance of the artistic skill, the ability to put down on paper or canvas or whatever your medium is, exactly what you want to achieve, and the understanding of what it is that you might be looking at. So some worker artists won't have quite the same capacity as others. One of the most interesting examples I know of is Kerry Richards, who's a great artist from Wales, who was one of the first sort of really successful working class artists and artists to come from working class background and really make it on a big scale in the 20th century. Kerry Richards did a series as a commissioned war artist during the Second World War on the tinplate industry in South Wales, which was informed by the fact that his father had been a tinplate worker, and that as a boy he'd regularly been in the tinplate works. So when he went to paint it as a war artist, he really understood what he was looking at, and combined extraordinarily powerful imagery, well worth looking up, with a real understanding of the subject and the technology and the labour. You can see in his drawings, more than almost anybody else I can think of, the effort and the pain in the work of working at a rolling mill and in a tinplate works.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's a couple of other comments and questions, but I'll pass them on to you, and we can answer them separately. So, because we're up to time. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thanks on behalf of all of us, Peter. It's a real pleasure, really interesting, setting a broad context. And I think it would be interesting for the attendees, but also the other panelists, to consider what is their motivation for the art that they're going to talk about next. Is it to describe, promote, respond, or imagine? So I think that's a really interesting framework for the rest of the day. So thank you very much for your time.